Alrighty, here I'm going to be recording for pod 23. It's a great number. This is going to be from 38th C in the Greek pagination, essentially from the point at which Socrates is now speaking to the jury after they have both convicted him and sentenced him to death. He's in the last section we went over last time, he has proposed alternative penalties as far as free meals for himself, being treated like an Olympic athlete, and then also essentially proposing a significant monetary fine of certain amounts that's increased by Plato, Crito, Critobulus, Apollodorus. So whether that's Plato just saying, hey, I really urged him to propose 30 minas or whatever, that notwithstanding, Socrates has made his, whether you view them as ironical or not, he's made his counter-proposal, and now he's going to react to being sentenced to death. So Socrates starts, for the sake of a little time, men of Athens, you're going to earn from those who wish to denigrate our city both the reputation and the blame for having killed Socrates, that wise man. For those who wish to reproach you will, of course, claim that I'm wise, even if I'm not. In any case, if you'd waited a short time, this would have happened of its own accord. You, of course, see my age. You see that I'm already far along in life and close to death. I'm saying this not to all of you, but to those who voted for the death penalty. And to those same people I also say this. Perhaps you imagine, gentlemen, that I was convicted for lack of the sort of arguments I could have used to convince you if I thought I should do or say anything to escape the penalty. Far from it. I have been convicted for a lack, not of arguments, however, but of bold-faced shamelessness, and for being unwilling to say the sort of things to you that you'd have been most pleased to hear, with me weeping and wailing and doing and saying many other things I claim are unworthy of me, but that are the very sorts of things you're used to hearing from everyone else. No, I didn't think then that I should do anything servile because of the danger I faced, and so I don't regret now that I defended myself as I did. I'd far rather die after such a defense than live like that. So to go through this paragraph here, I mean, men of Athens, you're going to earn from those who wish to again denigrate our city both the reputation and the blame for having killed Socrates. So if any of you've read the Eye of Stone book, The Trial of Socrates, you know that Eye of Stone puts it in terms of Socrates allegedly being one of the people who does denigrate the city of Athens. And I think if you look through the Platonic material in general, if you look at Plato's sort of skeptical opinion on justice, broadly speaking, and then essentially not allowing his own city to be an exception to that, and then the sort of narrative aspect of Socrates being put to death by the democracy, as Socrates himself points out, there's going to be blame, it's going to hurt the reputation of the city, and people are going to say they put to death a wise person. And Socrates, he also points out, he says, I'm old enough that I would have, if you had waited a short time, this would have happened of its own accord. So that's a possible rejoinder to the people who think that Socrates deliberately provokes this in order to speed along his death, that he doesn't seem eager for that himself, and he's really attributing that to the jurors who've sort of voted to put him to death. And so he also points out, he says, I'm basically being convicted of a lack of shamelessness not engaging in the sort of pitiful behaviors that a lot of people will exhibit when they're on trial for these sorts of things. And, you know, to say this is judgmental is true, but it also seems true that, you know, there's lots of situations where all people want is some sort of token apology or some token punishment or some this, that, and the other. And it's just important for somebody like a Socrates to really hold these people's feet to the fire and say, you know, I've been convicted for a lack of shamelessness, and I'm unwilling to do the weeping and wailing routine that a lot of other people do. And I don't think that's worth doing anyway. I'd rather die than live like that. So he continues, you see, whether in a trial or in a war, neither I nor anyone else should contrive to escape death at all costs. In battle, too, it often becomes clear that one might escape death by throwing down one's weapons and turning to supplicate one's pursuers. And in each sort of danger, there are many other ways one can contrive to escape death if one is shameless enough to do or say anything. The difficult thing, gentlemen, is in escaping death. Escaping villainy is much more difficult, since it runs faster than death. And now I, slow and old as I am, having been overtaken by the slower runner, while my accusers, clever and sharp-witted as they are, have been overtaken by the faster one, vice. Now I take my leave, convicted of you of a capital crime, whereas they stand forever convicted by the truth of wickedness and injustice. And just as I accept my penalty, so must they. Perhaps things had to turn out this way, and I suppose it's good they have. Next, I want to make a prophecy to those who convicted me. Indeed, I am now at the point at which men prophesy most when they're about to die. I say to you, men who condemn me to death, that as soon as I am dead, vengeance will come upon you, and it will be much harsher by Zeus than the vengeance you take in killing me. You did this now in the belief that you'll escape giving an account of your lives, but I say that quite the opposite will happen to you. There will be more people to test you, whom I now restrain, though you didn't notice my doing so. They'll be all the harsher on you, since they're younger, and you'll resent it all the more. You see, if you imagine that by killing people you prevent anyone from reproaching you for not living the right way, you're not thinking straight. In fact, to escape is neither possible nor noble. On the contrary, what's best and easiest isn't to put down other people, but prepare yourself to be the best one can. For that prophecy to those of you who voted to convict me, I take my leave. So just to go over this long paragraph here. So he points out whether in a trial in war, he's basically saying courage is meaning you don't always escape death or consider that to be the end that you want to pursue. He says escaping villainy is much more difficult. It runs faster than death. I've been overtaken by the slower runner, aka death, while the accusers are overtaken by villainy. So he's convicted of a crime, whereas they're convicted by the truth of wickedness and injustice. So he accepts his penalty, so must they. So a lot of good things here, and then he says perhaps things had to turn out this way, and so I suppose it's good they have. That's a big piece of evidence if you want to go the ironic route, and was he triggering these people into doing this, etc. I don't want to dive too deep into that. We've run the gamut on that discussion, but and then he makes his prophecy to those who convicted him, points out that people prophesy most when they're about to die. Says as soon as he's dead, vengeance will come upon you, harsher than the vengeance you take. People will test you. I restrain them. You didn't notice I was doing that. They'll be harsher on you. You'll resent it more. And if you think that by essentially killing one person, you're going to prevent dissent, you're going to prevent people from questioning you, he's saying that's foolish. And then at the end, In fact, to escape is neither possible nor noble. On the contrary, what's best and easiest isn't to put down other people, to prepare oneself to be the best one can. So he just makes a prophecy saying that they're harming their reputation by doing this, and he invokes Zeus. So again, things to consider when looking at Socrates' religious profile and other such things. And then he continues, however, I'd gladly discuss this result with those who voted for my acquittal, while the officers of the court are busy, and I'm not yet on my way to the place where I must die. Please stay with me, gentlemen, just for that short time. After all, there's nothing to prevent us from having a talk with one another while it's still in our power. To you, whom I regard as friends, I'm willing to show the meaning of what has now just happened. You see, gentlemen, the jury, for in calling you jurors, I no doubt used that term correctly. An amazing thing has happened to me. In my previous times, the usual prophecies of my daimonic sign were always very frequent, opposing me even on trivial matters if I was about to do something that wasn't right. Now, however, something has happened to me, as you can see for yourselves, that one might think to be, and that's generally regarded as being the worst of all bad things. Yet the God's sign did not oppose me when I left home this morning, or when I came up here to the law court, or anywhere in my speech when I was about to say something, even though in discussions it has often stopped me in the middle of what I was saying. Now, however, where this affair is concerned, it has opposed me, and nothing I either said or did. Just pause there real quick on that paragraph. So, I guess he doesn't care if the people who voted to convict him leave, but he wants his homies who voted on his side to stick with him, and he uses the rhetorical tactic. It's like, you guys are the real jurors. And then he points out, he's basically like, my daimonic sign has opposed me in nothing I either said or did, and therefore I feel very confident in what I've done here today. The other thing to note here, just to chew on some of these details here, noting again when I said that he's potentially epileptic or autistic or this, that, and the other, again, look at what we're referring to when we say, anywhere in my speech when I was about to say something, even though in other discussions has often stopped me in the middle of what I was saying. So these sort of events that are interrupting and uncontrollable, etc., that's what just gives some indication that may be a good explanation for this behavior. And then to continue, what then do I suppose is the explanation for that? So how did his daimon not oppose him? I'll tell you. See, it's likely that what's happened to me is a good thing, and that those of you who suppose death to be bad make an incorrect supposition. I have strong evidence of this, since there's no way my usual sign would have failed to oppose me if I weren't about to achieve something good. But let's bear it in mind that the following is also a strong reason to hope that death may be something good. Being dead is one of two things: either that dead are nothing, as it were, and have no awareness whatsoever of anything at all, or else, as we're told, it's some sort of change, a migration of the soul from here to another place. Now, if there's in fact no awareness, but it's like sleep, the kind in which a sleeper has no dream whatsoever, then death may be an amazing advantage. For I imagine that if someone had to pick a night in which he slept so soundly that he didn't even dream, and had to compare all the other nights and days of his life with that one, and then, having considered the matter, had to say how many days or nights he had spent better and more pleasantly than that night, I imagine that not just some private individual, but even some great king would find them easy to count compared to the other days and nights. Well, if death's like that, I say it's an advantage, since in that case the whole of time would seem no longer than a single night. I guess with the great king, they're referring to the Persian emperor or king, whatever. That's a note. I did want to go over some other stuff though. So one thing is, this sort of daimonic sign thing. The good thing is, I guess Socrates is saying this thing has to appear to him regularly enough to regulate his behavior, because otherwise, how would he get sort of moral guidance in certain matters? But there's also the danger of, basically having the rhetorical strategy of saying, oh, well, I have a prophetic sign, and it doesn't tell me to do things, it only tells me not to do things. But if I don't do what I'm not supposed to do, then, whatever it is that I end up doing as a result of that must be good. That's a sort of danger of this sort of thinking, whether it's Socrates doing it or anybody else. And so that's just to say, Socrates, even himself, he's always looking for ways to be best. And I guess this is his way. He thinks this is like his best sign of what is good and not good to do is following his daimonic sign. But again, it's just something to note. And then he points out the strong reason to hope death may be something good. Then makes it's a good analogy, but ultimately it's a flawed analogy between death and a dreamless sleep. And basically, how pleasant is it when you sleep and you can't even remember? If death was like a single night, then well, that's not so bad. And I guess the arguments to be made against that is essentially the sleep is not what's enjoyed in itself, although arguably it is, but it's the sensation upon awaking from said sleep and having the recollection of the of the sleep is therapeutic and whatnot is what gives it that quality. And therefore, this might be a bad example, because then again, the pleasantness of that sleep is, I guess, tied up in you waking up and experiencing it and to appreciate it. So, but this is, again, another interesting opinion of Socrates, is that potentially there's just kind of the obliteration of the soul with the cessation of bodily activities, and I think he considers it logically. I don't know if he'd be the most satisfied with it at the end of the day, but he has to lay it out as a certain sort of possibility. But then he also says, on the other hand, if death's a journey from here to another place, and if what we're told is true, and all those who've died are indeed there, what could be a greater good than that of gentlemen of the jury? If on arriving in Hades and leaving behind the people who claim to be jurors here, one's going to find those who are truly judges and jurors, the very ones who are said to sit in judgment there, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Achaeus, Triptolemus, all the other demigods who were just in their own lifetimes. How could the journey be a wretched one? So to pause here before we chew on this next paragraph, there's also the important point of Socrates, and the phrasing here is good, talking about death either being nothing at all or some sort of change, a migration of the soul from here to another place. That's, I guess, where people get this term transmigration from, and the transmigration of the souls from one place to another. And long story short, to give sort of the intellectual argument behind it, Plato basically believes that knowledge is recollected rather than acquired from the world, in terms of properly understanding what knowledge is, and that therefore the recollective nature of knowledge implies the previous existence of our souls. Otherwise, essentially, there's the Meno problem of knowledge, of how will you recognize knowledge when you come upon it unless you were already familiar with it. sort of a brilliant dilemma posed there. And it's not to get too far away from this part of the apology, but again, these ideologies and these ideas are carried forward fairly consistently through this whole thing, and so that's good reason to basically believe that when you want to think about the quote-unquote historical Socrates, I think there's a good reason to believe that he personally believed in a transmigration of the soul. And then as I read the next paragraph, you're going to see with the amount of coloring he gives to it, it's quite clear that he does believe in it. And then again, his dilemma he posed earlier about death now is, rather than a false dichotomy, is almost a positive dichotomy in the opposite sense of the logical fallacy, where it's two possibilities that are both pleasant, one of which he obviously prefers, but the other one of which he can also accept, death being nothing as opposed to it being some sort of journey. But to go over some of the figures he just spoke about in terms of the journey and arriving in Hades, he talks about Minos, legendary king of Crete, also imprisoner of the Minotaur, the Bull of Minos, etc., the Theseus myth. So, big myth for the Athenians as well. Rhadamanthus as well. Orpheus, Orpheus is mentioned later, so let's actually go through that paragraph, because he mentions some demigods, but then Socrates continues after talking about those who sit in judgment, the other demigods who were just in their lifetimes. Or again, what would any one of you not give to talk to Orpheus and Musaeus, Hesiod and Homer? I'd be willing to die many times over if that were true. See for myself. At any rate, spending time there would be amazing. When I met Palamedes or Ajax, son of Telamon, or anyone else of old who died because of an unjust verdict, I could compare my own experience with theirs, as I suppose it wouldn't be unpleasing to do so. And in particular, the most important thing, I could spend time examining and searching people there, just as I do here, to find out who among them is wise, who thinks he is, but isn't. So, what would you give to talk to Orpheus, the legendary bard, founder of the mystical religion of Orphism? Musaeus, usually associated with Orpheus, also a legendary bard. So, mentioning some of the some musicians, as well as Hesiod and Homer, which obviously puts them in that sort of tradition. And clearly somebody like Socrates probably would like to examine these people in just the way, and as he says, start examining and searching people just as I do here, find out who among them is wise, who thinks he is but isn't. What wouldn't one give, gentlemen of the jury, to be able to examine the great leader of the great expedition against Troy, or Odysseus, or Sisyphus, or countless other men and women one could mention? To talk to them there, to associate with them and examine them, wouldn't that be inconceivable happiness? In any case, the people there certainly don't kill one another for doing it, for if what we're told is true, the people there are both happier in all of the respects than people here, and also deathless for the remainder of time. So, mentioning a lot of aspects of their myths, what wouldn't you give to, examine Agamemnon? What wouldn't you give to examine Odysseus? So he puts those two people in the same sentence, and then he puts Sisyphus in that sentence, legendary king, founder of Corinth, also a dude who rolls rock uphill forever under in Hades. That's a punishment, I guess. So, but he's mentioning those people he talks about Palamedes, who was essentially Odysseus's rival. So again, it's funny that in the prioritization of things, the first person mentioned in this process by Socrates is allegedly Palamedes, not Odysseus. So therefore, Socrates is more interested or prioritizes the mentioning of meeting Palamedes over the meeting of Odysseus. But then again, just to show examination of Agamemnon or Odysseus. And then this is why I've had ideas in the past of trying to imagine a sort of Socratic examination of either Pericles or Odysseus or some of these other figures to basically be like, hey, can we have a Socratic style analysis of this person? And he points out, he says, you know, it would make me very happy to associate with them and talk with them, etc. And he says people there are happier, they're deathless for the remainder of time. And so I guess he also says there's countless other men and women. So a shout out to Socrates for finally realizing he can talk to a woman once he dies. Or we'll see more in Symposium, I guess. But yeah, he still says way too many misogynistic things from my perspective. But to continue with Socrates, he says, but you too, gentlemen of the jury, should be of good hope in the face of death, and bear in mind this single truth: nothing bad can happen to a good man, whether in life or death, nor that are the gods unconcerned about his troubles. What has happened to me hasn't happened by chance. Rather, it's clear to me that to die now and escape my troubles was a better thing for me. It was for this very reason that my sign never opposed me. And so, for my part, I am not at all angry with those who voted to condemn me, or with my accusers, and yet this wasn't what they had in mind when they were condemning and accusing me. No, they thought to harm me, and for that they deserve to be blamed. The small favor, however, I ask of them, when my sons come of age, gentlemen, punish them by harassing them in the very same way that I harassed you, if they seem to you to take care of wealth or anything before virtue, if they think they're someone when they're no one, reproach them just as I reproached you. Tell them that you don't care for the things that they don't care for the things they should, and think they're someone when they're worth nothing. If you will do that, I'll have received my own just deserts from you, as will my sons. But now it's time to leave, I to die and you to live. Which of us goes to the better thing, however, is unclear to everyone except the God. So that concludes Plato's Apology. Taking a little while to get here, but like I said, these sort of line-by-line analyses can be pretty interesting and sort of work backwards from what he says, because it's always interesting to retrace in sort of the opposite direction from Socrates, because he's so well spoken and so logical in what he says that even if you can break something down and say something's not consistent with something he said before, it's usually because he examined something and departed from a previous opinion and then is sort of constructing new opinions. But he has a clever line of, it's time to leave, I to die, you to live. Who's going to the better thing? It's unclear to everyone except for Apollo. He points out, or he requests that people give the same sort of conduct that he did to others, that they treat that way for his sons. And somebody could rightly point out, why don't you do that yourself, Socrates? But it ain't the way it's not the way it worked. And we'll see more when we do Crito for why it's the case and why he's not willing to take the easy way out. He's already hinted at this with his military comments of not abandoning his posts. But then again, to kind of go over this sort of Socratic or Platonic sort of idea, basically that nothing bad can happen to a good man, and that means that you have to understand what something bad and good man is properly, to understand that they can probably still have things happen that people consider to be bad, but Socrates would want to redefine that. And so in these sections, again, he's talking mostly to the people who voted to acquit him after he makes his sort of angrier prophecies, and he basically talks to them about his opinions on death. And he says, in my opinion, there's really not a downside here. Therefore, I'm not excessively concerned about it. I'm not going to do the whole crying routine that a lot of people would want me to do. So that's a good amount of material to go over. So that's good for pod 23. So just to reconsider at the end here, the sort of question I wanted to start out with, which I summarized at the end of the last podcast, is essentially for this, when he's addressing them after his having been sentenced to death, does Socrates have a change in tone from the previous section to this one? And I think he does, because I think he takes off. Yeah. So I would say that for the most part throughout the rest of this, he completely takes off sort of the irony mask and only really speaks from his genuine perspective. There's not a lot of irony to the things he's saying. Even so, in this section, he's gone from sort of joking about, I'd have to have an excessive love of life to propose exile sort of thing. The unexamined life isn't worth living for a human being, to, for the sake of a little time, men of Athens, I'm going to dive right into it, and starts ripping into them. And so really interesting content, and a lot of clever, pithy lines. Still said escaping villainy is much more difficult, but again, I don't think those things are meant in an ironic way. I think he's fairly serious when he's saying those things. And so if I was answering my own question, I'd say there's certainly a tone change. He's become much more serious. He's really not joking anymore, and now he's putting kind of all his cards on the table. He tells them his opinions on the issue of death, basically trying, I think, to assure people he doesn't consider being convicted and sentenced to death to be a true evil for him. Look at all the ways this could benefit me. I could examine Hesiod and Homer, Palamedes, Agamemnon, Odysseus, etc. And he does believe nothing bad can happen to a good man, and call that presumptuous, but he thinks himself to be a good person, and he has conviction in that belief. And so that brings to a wrap Plato's Apology. So now for this series of Page of Plato, we've slowly gone through now Plato's Euthyphro, and now Plato's Apology. So the next step in this process would be to go through Plato's Crito, Crito being the next one in sort of the tragedy of Socrates sort of set. So we'll go over that in the next podcast. That's a shorter dialogue, I believe. So again, more opportunities for deep dives. By the time I'm doing this on material like Phaedo, Meno, Symposium, God help me doing it on Republic, there's no way I'm going to basically be able to read you the whole friggin' thing. So I'm going to have to rethink the presentation style. But for now, I'm fairly satisfied with this, so I'll leave it there. So that's pod 23. All right, thanks.